How threatening are extremist groups to this nation? To find out, let's welcome Irwin Suall. He's director of the fact-finding department of the Anti-Defamation League of Bnai Brith. He served as an expert witness on extremism in federal court trials, congressional hearings, and before the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And Dr. David Lowe is associate director of the ADL. He's also author of numerous articles and reports on political extremism. Extremism. Let's define it, Mr. Suall, and the right and left. How would you define that as well?
Well, that's a tall order. Extremism, I would say, represents any movement that represents a threat to democratic life in America, a threat to the democratic institutions of our society. And the right and left are traditionally those who want to turn back the clock to a previous period, that's the right, and the left, those who want to go fast forward. But in both cases, they are extreme in that they want the changes to take place immediately, and they want the changes to take place not through the means of democratic discussion and decision and legislation, but by radical measures.
Are there times for that kind of extremism? Is it when we are economically depressed? When do you have this kind of extremism, Dr. Lowe?
I think the conventional wisdom is that when you are in a time of deep depression, that's a time when people tend to be attracted to these groups. But we don't necessarily adhere to that point of view. Empirically, studies have found that there are all kinds of reasons for the growth of extremism, mainly related to social turmoil and that sort of thing.
Well, give us some examples of the social turmoil of what you speak.
Well, a good example would be the 1960s. Or if you want to go back further, the 1920s, a time of great social change and upheaval, a time when, for example, the Ku Klux Klan in this country had its greatest moments, greatest heyday.
But you all say now that the Ku Klux Klan is not having a heyday, that they're losing their membership, they're losing their clout.
There's no question about that. The Klan is not doing very well these days. By the way, the Klan today is not to be compared at all to the Klan of the 1960s, for example. Today's Klan has some 6,500 members nationally. In the 1960s, they had about 55,000. And in the 1920s, to which David just made reference, they had as many as 3 to 5 million members. So the Klan is really not doing that very well.
Why aren't they doing so well? What's being lost there? Why are they losing the clout?
Mainly because the conditions in the United States over the past several years have not given rise to radical feelings among people. People don't feel that dissatisfied with what's going on. The Klan did seem to be doing well from approximately 1975 to 1981. And beginning in 81, there began a decline. The decline, we think, is the result of several things. Number one, inflation was conquered. Number two, there is a restoration of feeling of pride in the country and of a general feeling among people that things are going not too badly.
So people don't feel as though they're losing something to another group. Is that what you're saying?
That's part of it, yes. By the way, an important part of extremism of the right in particular, is what one can call a backlash. When people feel that changes have taken place that put them in a position of having lost status in the society, making them feeling that their own children are strangers to them, and the conditions around them are bewildering. That's when they tend to react strongly with a backlash. And the Klan, for example, thrives on that sort of thing.
Sounds like you're talking about middle America, if you will. When they feel threatened, they turn, and they turn towards a group that might voice their feelings.
Yes, but middle America has rejected the Klan overwhelmingly, and
Well,
has
let's talk
rejected
about other
the
groups.
radical right.
What about the other extremist groups out there? Let's not just focus on the Klan. What else is out there?
Well, I think what Irwin has said about the Klan has applied, and we can apply to other groups, such as groups like the neo-Nazi groups, or groups that...
What about silent movement?
Sorry?
Is it silent movement?
Silent
brotherhood.
majority.
Silent
brotherhood.
No, silent brotherhood. I'm sorry.
Silent brotherhood.
Silent
Right.
brotherhood.
That's something else, sometimes known as the Order. This was a group of, is that the group you're referring to?
Group
This was a group, an underground terrorist organization that arose several years ago of mostly young men who felt that precisely because the extremist movement in general had not been making headway by the usual tactics of propaganda, recruitment, and so on, a group of them on the West Coast decided that they were going to take the law into their own hands, bypass the normal procedure of the slow process of building their organization, and engage in terrorism and violence. And what they did was to kill several people, including a Jewish radio talk show host in Denver, a man by the name of Alan Berg. They robbed a number of banks. They robbed some Brinks armored vehicles, and they engaged in general mayhem. They, as you may know, were arrested. The FBI hunted them down. They were tried in Seattle quite recently, and as a result, a number of them are, all of them, as a matter of fact, are spending time in prison right now. Some of them with sentences as long as 100 years.
You know, when you say that this kind of activity is subsiding, that means I shouldn't worry about them.
Not at all. No, as a matter of fact, it's precisely because there has been a decline in the ranks of the radical right and to some extent the radical left that we should be very concerned about possible acts of terrorism such as those that Irwin described. There's a feeling of great desperation. There's a feeling that the propaganda hasn't worked. We haven't been able to add to our membership by the word, so let's turn to the deed. And what has sometimes been referred to as propaganda, the deed or terrorism, has had an appeal in the ranks of the far right.
So you're saying, as we sit here now, there are groups of people out there somewhere in television land who are plotting and planning against people, against the government?
Well, there's no question. There was a meeting held last month in the state of Idaho. We know because we know from our own sources that this was the case.
Do you have representatives who are infiltrating these groups?
With the Anti-Defamation League monitors all extremist groups in the United States, of the right and of the left. Now, we do it by a variety of means, equivalent roughly to what you might call investigative reporting. We don't reveal publicly all the means that we use, except to say we have one very strong rule, and that is we do nothing illegal. Our means of investigations are within the framework of law.
Once you monitor these groups and you publish the report, what's the next step for you? Do you work in conjunction with the FBI? Do you work in conjunction with the Secret Service, CIA?
We share our findings with the law enforcement agencies and with legislators, with public officials. It's important that they be aware of what's happening.
But are public officials as concerned as you
Some are, some are not.
Who are and who aren't, and why aren't the ones?
Well, no, I'm not going to get caught in that trap. And it's not a matter of political party, incidentally. Well, I'm not going to explain it. In any case, it's our responsibility to inform the public so that the public can be aware of the nature of the problem, and they, in turn, bring pressure to bear on legislators so that they can take, if necessary, appropriate action. I want to point out that the Anti-Defamation League believes in the First Amendment. We believe in free speech, even for those people whose views we detest. It's when they break the law, it's when they act in illegal fashion that there's a law enforcement problem, and of course we share our information with law enforcement agencies.
How does John Q. average person like you and I, if you didn't have to be if you weren't as well versed in these extremist groups as you are, how would you know that the dialogue that you're hearing is a little unusual at this stage of the game? I mean, unless they're discussing extreme terrorist activities, how would you know that it's slightly different? And maybe you should be calling your local sheriff to say, this group is meeting and I'm a little worried about it.
Well, no, there's no need to call the local sheriff. If you hear things that you simply detest, that you simply find objectionable, the sheriff is only to be called when you hear things that sound like someone's planning to engage in breaking the law. But the surest telltale sign that you're in the presence of extremism is bigotry, hate.
Speaking of Lyndon LaRouche, you've defined him as, how would you consider Lyndon, right or left?
A mixture of both. The LaRouche organization is an extremist group which began on the far left, now is often called on the far right, but in fact what they advocate is a sort of a mishmash, a sort of a hodgepodge of extreme left and right views.
What about numbers of people involved with the LaRouches?
The LaRouche organization has a hardcore following, not very large, maybe, about 1,000 people nationally.
Very recently, which is a serious problem. They've placed on the ballot in the state of California a proposition, I think it's Proposition 62, which would require that the state of California isolate, what's the word I'm looking for?
Quarantine.
Quarantine victims of AIDS, You know, we're talking about California, which includes San Francisco and Los Angeles. AIDS is a real problem there. Their solution, they thrive on exploiting fear. And that's just what they've done in California with this easy solution, which is to isolate and quarantine and victimize those who are already victims of AIDS.
We hope the voters aren't sleeping there. We'll be back with my guests after a short break.
Anti-Defamation League's investigations show that the prisons are a major target for recruitment by extremist groups. And the reason for it's an interesting factor. The reason for it is that many of the worst extremists in the country are in prison today. In recent years, there's been a spate of criminal activity on the part of extremists of the far right and the far left. Shootings, bombings, holdups of banks and whatnot. And lots of those folks are in prison these days, where they themselves are engaged in recruitment of their fellow inmates, and the outside extremist groups are systematically working the prisons in an effort to recruit.
All right, Dr. David Lowe, what are the groups that are working the prisons, and what happens? They form these groups within the prison, and then as they move outside, they move out to the family outside?
It's not quite that simple. There are a number of prison gangs operating in both federal and state prison institutions.
East and West Coast.
East and West Coast. And the expectation on the part of extremist groups on the outside is that they can tap into this constituency. It's kind of a ready-made constituency of prison gangs that are organized largely on racial lines, and that they can use the organization that's already established in the prison to help their own efforts to get them interested in their own activities outside the prison, and the expectation that when they leave prison, they will join up with them.
Good example, by the way, occurred just a couple of weeks ago when a young man who had been recruited in a California prison, Lompoc Federal Prison, by the Aryan Nations, a racist and anti-Semitic, extremely anti-Semitic organization headquartered in Idaho, was recruited in California, then moved to the Midwest, where he attached himself to another extremist group in Michigan, and recently is charged with having robbed a bank, had a shootout with the local police department in Illinois, and is now being sought by the FBI, recruited in prison. Another example, a young man by the name of Gary Lee Yarborough was recruited originally in federal prison in Arizona. Then when he was released, linked up also with the Aryan Nations, he used the printing, what he learned in prison in his rehabilitation program, how to print. He used it at the printing plant of the Aryan Nations to print up extremist literature and, we believe, also counterfeit money. And then joined a group called the Silent Brotherhood, or sometimes known as the Order, engaged in a long string of criminal acts, and was sentenced this past spring to a sentence of 100 years in federal prison as a result of participating in those acts, originally recruited as a young man in the prison.
Let's talk a little about the Aryan Nation. Who is attracted to that organization?
Well, it's an organization that deals in hatred.
But where do the
Bigotry.
people come from?
By and large, from the West, from the Rocky Mountain states and the West Coast. They do have some members in the East. They even have some members in Pennsylvania. But by and large, it's a Western group composed of young, mainly men, but also some women, whites, largely from rural areas, who are, I can't tell you how viciously anti-Semitic they are. Their theory is they hold to something called the identity theory, which holds that the true Jews are not the Jews, but rather the white Aryan people, and that those people who call themselves Jews are the seeds of Satan and have to be murdered. And they are truly genocidal in their attitudes toward Jews and viciously racist in their attitudes toward blacks. The funny thing about it is many of them come from small communities, small Western communities, where there are no Jews and no blacks. So a lot of it is fantasy land that has been built up as a result of their absorption somehow or other of racist and hate literature.
Could I just add to that? The Order, back to the terrorist organization, which was formed in large measure by former members of the Aryan Nations and other hate groups. We took a look at the backgrounds of those who were the hardcore activists of this organization. Interestingly enough, we found that you couldn't generalize about the kinds of backgrounds they came from. Some came from rather comfortable backgrounds, middle-class families, some had gone to private schools, some were honor students in college, in addition to rural, poor, and the kinds of background characteristics that we normally associate with groups like the Klan. Interestingly enough, prison authorities in a number of jurisdictions have confiscated literature of a violent nature.
The Aryan nations, their groups in prison called themselves the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, which is in fact the other side of the coin of the Aryan nations. Their doctrine is, they'd say the Bible teaches racism, the Bible teaches anti-Semitism, and therefore when we preach racism and anti-Semitism, we're doing it in the name of religion. And of course, when prison authorities say, we're not going to allow into this prison the kind of hate material which will cause chaos and disorder among the members of the various racial groups in the prisons, then they've gone, these extremist groups have gone to court. The courts generally have upheld the prison authorities when the prison authorities have said, we're not cracking down on religion, we're not denying anyone their right to believe in anything they want religiously, but we're cracking down on potential chaos and disorder and racist violence in the prisons. The courts have upheld them on those grounds.
There's an interesting case recently that came out of the Central District, Federal District in Illinois, involving a group called El Rukin. It's a black Chicago-based gang which is thought to be run now by a gentleman who is in a Texas institution on cocaine charges. The group in the prison in Illinois said, we're a religion, we have the right to organize as a religion, and the court held that that was not the case, that they could not be considered a religion, that they were a threat to institutional security, and therefore have been denied by the court the right to organize. And we learned recently, a report has come out recently, that members of the El Rukin gang have made contact with the...
Weren't they formerly the Blackstone Rangers? Blackstone
Rangers, then changed to the Black Peastone Nation, and now they call themselves El Rukin, and they claim that their religion is Sunni Muslim.
They have a relationship, by the way, with the Nation of Islam, which is the Louis Farrakhan-led organization based in Chicago.
As soon as you say there's a relationship, and as soon as you mention Louis Farrakhan, everybody gets their hackles up.
Well,
what kind of a relationship are we talking about?
Farrakhan has had representatives of the El Rukin group speak at some of his mass meetings. He had a meeting
What
at
have
Savior's
they advocated when they've spoken? Are you privy to that?
Well, they've followed the Farrakhan line, which is basically that a race war is coming and that we have to prepare for it. They were given honored treatment at a recent Savior's Day meeting in Chicago, where a satellite hookup where they gave Muammar Gaddafi a satellite hookup, and he preached to the throng there the need for those in attendance at this meeting to commit acts of sedition against the American government.
Then what do we do about it?
Well, one thing we do is see to it that our legislators, our public representatives, give full support to the law enforcement and corrections community in America. The fellows that are right on the front line, so to speak, the police officers and the wardens, and so that they know that there's public support for strict enforcement of the law. I'm talking about enforcement of the law. Again, I want to repeat, the Anti-Defamation League believes that everyone has the right to his point of view, no matter how we may detest that point of view. But when they start breaking the law, engaging in violence, talking about overthrowing the government, talking about engaging in race war, that's the time for the law enforcement community to do its job. And our responsibility, the Anti-Defamation League, and the media generally, I would say, is to inform the public so the public knows that there is a potential problem there, so that we don't hide our heads in the sand, and that we give support to the law enforcement community and to the educators. There's an important role here for education, for public schools, for libraries, for the media, again, to inform the American people as to these potential threats to good order in our society, to the rights not only of minority groups, although minorities are the prime victims, but to the rights of all Americans.
Well, you say
just as you're doing now.
Yeah. Is the media meeting its responsibility? Are educators meeting their responsibility at this point in time?
The answer is, as always, yes and no. Obviously, there's room for improvement, But on the whole, I would say that, and you know, we've been tracking extremism in the United States, we, the Anti-Defamation League, since 1913. By and large, this has not been such a bad period. The extremist groups, far right and far left, have been declining somewhat. So we're not feeling that menaced. We're not feeling so threatened that we regard it as a period of crisis. On the other hand, there is always that potential, and therefore we have to keep educating and keep informing the public as to this potential problem.
Are there any laws on the books that you feel, or are there any laws on the books that should be on the book? Are there laws that should be on the books that aren't, that you feel are needed in this area?
Well, the Anti-Defamation League has proposed, has sponsored model legislation in many state legislatures in this country to make it a crime to teach training in weaponry with the intent to create civil disorder. And we're happy to say that this has become law now in, I think, about 14 states.
We have to pay a lot of attention to what we're reading and what's going on in our community then. Yeah. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both very much for being with us. Thanks to my guests, Irwin Suall and Dr. David Lowe of the Anti-Defamation League of Bnai Brith. I want you to join me for more Straight Talk Monday through Friday mornings at 7:30. We're also on the first and third Sunday evenings of each month at 10. I'm Denise Richardson. You have a good day.